West Texas, 1870. A 19-year-old boy stands in Denton County with 100 head of cattle. The brand on their hips reads 6666, 4 sixes in a row. He does not know where it came from. He does not know who invented it. 260,000 acres, 7,000 mother cows, 119 pastures, a town of 300 kept alive by a single ranch. Legendary. Yes, but the legend does not tell you this. The poker story is a lie. The brand's origin is unknown. Even the founder never knew. Drought, debt, death. Deals with Comanche chiefs and sitting presidents, blizzards that killed thousands, oil that saved everything, television that turned a business into mythology. Is the 4 sixes a monument to vision and grit? Or an engine that survived by becoming whatever each century demanded? Which version is the truth? If you enjoy deep dives into historic ranch empires and the people who shaped them, please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments which ranch I should explore next. Your support helps make these documentaries possible. Chapter 1. The Boy and the Bargain. Before the brand meant prestige, it meant survival. Samuel Burke. Burnett was born in Bates County, Missouri, on January 1, 1849. His family would not stay long. In 1857, the violence began. Jayhawkers from Kansas, armed raiders who opposed slavery, crossed into Missouri and started burning homes. The border wars between Free State Kansas and Slave State Missouri had turned ordinary farmland into a battleground. By 1859, when Burke was 10 years old, the raids had reached the Burnett property. The family home burned. Everything they owned turned to ash. Jerry Burnett loaded his wife and children into a covered wagon and headed south. They drove for weeks, crossing rivers and territories, until they reached Denton County, Texas. The land was open. The grass was good. The violence was far behind them. Jerry Burnett started over with cattle and hope. It was here that Burke learned to ride, here that he learned to rope, here that he watched his father build a herd from nothing. The range was open in those days. Grass and water were free. You simply put your cattle on the land and let them grow. The economics were simple. The risks were immense. When the Civil War came, Jerry Burnett joined Wells' battalion of the Confederate Army. He left his teenage son to help run the family operation. Burke was not yet 15, but he was already doing the work of a man. By the time the war ended, he knew cattle the way other boys knew books. In 1867, at 18 years old, Burke Burnett became trail boss for his father's herd. 1,200 head of cattle, 10 men riding with him. The Chisholm Trail stretched north through Indian Territory, through Kansas, to the railheads at Abilene. He was said to be the youngest trail boss on the entire route that year. The drives were brutal. Cowboys earned $25 to $40 a month, plus food and a place to sleep. They worked 7 days a week. They rode in freezing rain and blistering sun. They crossed rivers that could drown a man before he knew he was in trouble. They watched for stampedes, which could kill entire crews if the timing was wrong. 1 in 3 cowboys on those early drives was African American or Mexican. History often forgets this. The trail crews were more diverse than the towns they rode through. A man who could ride, who could rope, who could work cattle in all weather, found employment regardless of his background. The work was too dangerous, and the labor too scarce for prejudice to dominate. Comanche and Kiowa raiders still operated in the territory. They took horses, they scattered herds, they left bodies. The Indian wars were not over. They would not be over for another decade. Every drive was a gamble against weather, disease, theft, and violence. Burke survived. He saved his wages, and in 1870 or 1871 he walked into Denton and bought 100 head of cattle from a man named Frank Crowley. The cattle already wore a brand, 4 sixes in a row. Burnett did not invent the mark. He did not win it in a poker game. The ranch itself has denied the poker story. The Texas State Historical Association has confirmed the denial. The truth is simpler and stranger. Burnett bought the brand already stamped on cattle, and no one knows who created it or why. The 4 sixes brand was difficult to alter. A rustler could take a simple design and transform it with a hot iron, but 4 sixes in sequence? Changing that to something else required more skill than most thieves possessed. Burnett was not thinking about legacy. He was thinking about protection. He moved the cattle to the Wichita River. He bought land at prices that seem impossible today. 25 cents an acre, 50 cents for better ground. He built a headquarters near what would become Wichita Falls. He married Ruth Braddock Lloyd, whose father, Colonel M.B. Lloyd, would provide the ranch's first cow horses. Every horse on the 4 sixes has been branded with the letter L on its left shoulder ever since. He started a family. He believed he had found a place to stay. And then the drought came. 1881. The grass died. The creeks went dry. Cattle dropped in the pastures, too weak to walk to water that no longer existed. Drought on the Texas plains is not like drought elsewhere. The land bakes. The wind strips moisture from everything it touches. Rivers that ran full in spring become cracked mud by summer. Wells go dry. Windmills spin uselessly over empty aquifers. Cattle stand in groups, waiting for relief that does not come. Burnett was not the only rancher watching his herd starve. Across the Texas Panhandle, men who had built fortunes on open range found themselves with animals they could not feed, and land that could not support them. Some sold out at a loss. Some simply walked away, leaving cattle to die where they stood. Burnett did neither. He drove his cattle north, past the Red River, into Indian territory, into land that belonged to the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Apache. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what had happened before. The tribes of the Southern Plains had been conquered. The Red River War of 1874 and 1875 had broken the last resistance. Quannock Parker, the most feared war chief of the Comanche, had surrendered at Fort Sill. The buffalo were gone, slaughtered by hide hunters until the herds that once numbered in the millions were reduced to scattered remnants. The federal government had confined the tribes to reservations. Nearly 500,000 acres were set aside for their use, a vast sea of grass called the Big Pasture. The land was good, the water was reliable, but the Indians did not have cattle to graze it. They did not have the means to use what they had been given. The Texas ranchers had the opposite problem: too many cattle, not enough grass, not enough water, not enough space. Burnett saw the opportunity. He approached the most powerful man on the reservation, Quannock Parker. Quanah was unlike any other Indian leader of his era. His mother was Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman captured as a child during the Fort Parker raid of 1836. She had been raised Comanche, had married Chief Peter Nocona, had given birth to Quanah. She was recaptured by Texas Rangers in 1860 and spent her remaining years grieving for the Comanche life she had lost. She died in 1870, and Quanah spent years searching for her remains. Quanah had fought against the army. He had led raids that terrorized settlers across Texas. He had been one of the last warriors to surrender, and now, confined to a reservation, he had transformed himself into something entirely different: a diplomat, a businessman, a man who understood that the old ways were gone and survival meant adaptation. The negotiations between Burnett and Quanah took days. The details were specific. The stakes were high. When the agreement was reached, Burnett had secured grazing rights to 300,000 acres of reservation land for 6.5 cents per acre. Let that number settle. 300,000 acres at 6.5 cents. Total annual payment roughly $19,500. For grass that could fatten 30,000 head of cattle. For water that flowed when Texas creeks ran dry. The lease payments went to the tribes. Nearly $20,000 a year flowed to the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache. Cash was distributed through the Indian Agency. $10 bills passed through windows to families holding government ration tickets. Some refused to take the money. They considered the arrangement a betrayal of everything their ancestors had fought for. The surplus was credited to the tribal accounts. Burnett was not the only rancher making deals. The Wagoners were there, the Herrings, Charles Goodnight, others. But Burnett became the primary liaison between the cattlemen and the tribes. He developed a relationship with Quanah Parker that would last for decades. The Comanche gave Burnett a name, Mas Sasuta, Big Boss. It was a mark of respect from people who had every reason to resent him. Quanah reportedly called Burnett his best white friend. He said it publicly. Big-hearted, rich cowman. The arrangement lasted 20 years. 20 years of grass and water and profit, while other ranchers struggled on land that could not support their herds. Burnett had found a way to survive the drought that should have destroyed him. The cost was a partnership with people his neighbors considered enemies. The reward was the foundation of an empire. But what happened in Quanah's household would bind the two families in ways no one expected. And once the bargain is made, how do you ever undo it? Chapter 2. Chiefs and Presidents. Inheritance doesn't just pass down land. It passes down enemies. Burke Burnett had a son named Thomas Lloyd, born in 1871. Tom was not like his father. Where Burke was steady and calculating, Tom was wild. Where Burke saw cattle as business, Tom saw adventure. The boy was trouble from the start. In the 1880s, Burke made a decision. He would send Tom to West Point. The military academy would discipline the boy, teach him structure, turn him into a man worthy of inheriting an empire. Tom was deposited at the imposing academy on the Hudson River. Burke went on to New York City on business. When Burke returned to Texas, he found his son had beaten him home. Tom had left West Point almost as soon as his father was out of sight. He wanted nothing to do with military discipline. He wanted to ride. Out of frustration, and knowing that Quanah Parker had taken several white boys under his wing over the years, Burke loaded his teenage son into a wagon and drove him across the Red River to the Comanche reservation. If the army could not discipline Tom, perhaps Quanah could. What happened next surprised everyone. Tom did not merely tolerate his time with Quanah. He embraced it. He moved into Star House, the 12-room mansion that Burke Burnett and other cattlemen had built for the chief. He lived with Quanah's family, surrounded by the chief's 7 wives and more than 20 children. He learned to speak Comanche fluently. Quanah taught Tom the language and culture of his people, the way the Comanche read the land, the stories passed down through generations of horsemen, the protocols of honor and hospitality that governed reservation life. In return, Tom taught Quanah the cattle business, the economics of breeding, the logistics of moving herds, the market forces that determined prices at the railheads. The two men, separated by age, culture, and the violence of recent history, became something like brothers. Star House itself was a monument to the strange partnership between conquerors and conquered. Texas cattlemen had funded its construction in 1889 as a reward for Quanah's help in negotiating the grazing leases. The lumber was hauled by double teams of mules from the railroad terminal at Harold, Texas, to the building site near Cache. At Quanah's request, 12 stars were painted on the roof. If Army generals could use stars to signify their rank, so could the chief of the Comanches. The stars were white against the dark shingles, visible from a distance, a declaration that the man who lived beneath them was someone of consequence. Distinguished visitors came to Star House. British Ambassador Lord Bryce, President Theodore Roosevelt, Generals Hugh Scott, Nelson Miles, and Frank Baldwin, Sioux Chief American Horse, Apache medicine man Geronimo, and young Tom Burnett, the Texas rancher's son who had failed at West Point but succeeded at becoming Comanche. Tom eventually returned to Texas. He became wagon boss of the 4-6's operation in Indian Territory. While still in his early 20s, he earned the same wages as other cowboys, earning his place through work rather than inheritance. On October 8, 1891, he married Olive Lake of Fort Worth. They had a daughter, Anne Valiant, born in 1900. But the bond between Tom and Quanah never broke. They hunted together. They appeared together at public events. Tom helped Quanah find and rebury the remains of Cynthia Ann Parker, the chief's white mother. Burnett money paid for the granite headstones that marked her grave and her daughter's. When Quanah Parker died in February 1911, a piece of Tom Burnett died with him. The man who had taught him to see the world through Comanche eyes was gone. But Tom carried what Quanah had taught him for the rest of his life. And the 4-6's carried something too, a legacy of unlikely alliance. A reminder that empires are sometimes built on friendships that cross every boundary the world erects. Meanwhile, a crisis was brewing that would test every connection Burke Burnett had made. 1900. The federal government decided to open the Kiowa Comanche Reservation to white settlement. The cattlemen were ordered to vacate their leases immediately. The order came without warning. No transition period, no accommodation for the ranchers who had invested years in developing the land. Simply leave. Now. Burnett had 30,000 cattle on that land. Moving them required time he did not have. Selling them at a loss would destroy years of work. Keeping them in place violated federal law. He was trapped. He needed an extension. He needed someone with the power to grant one. He needed access to the President of the United States. Texas Senator Joe Bailey made the introduction. The man across the table was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was unlike any president who had come before. A rancher himself, he had spent years in the Dakota Badlands after the deaths of his mother and first wife. He understood cattle. He understood the economics of moving herds across vast distances. He understood what it meant to have animals trapped on land you could not use. The conversation that followed is not recorded in detail. What is known is the result. Roosevelt granted Burnett and his fellow cattlemen a 2-year extension to move their herds in an orderly fashion. 2 years to find new land, 2 years to avoid catastrophe, 2 years purchased through political connection and personal appeal. In 1905, Burnett repaid the favor. He organized a wolf hunt in the big pasture and invited the president. Roosevelt arrived with an entourage of reporters and politicians. Tom Burnett, now in his 30s and a respected cattleman in his own right, set up a chuck wagon and brought horses and cowboys to a site near present-day Frederick, Oklahoma. Quanah Parker attended. For 10 days, the President of the United States hunted wolves on land that had belonged to the Comanche. He rode with cowboys. He ate at the chuck wagon. He posed for photographs with Quanah and Burnett. The hunt was productive. 17 wolves, 3 raccoons, countless rattlesnakes. Roosevelt wrote to his son Ted, "I do wish you could have been along on this trip." He praised Tom Burnett specifically. "You would have loved Tom Burnett, son of the big cattleman. He is a splendid fellow, about 30 years old, and just the ideal of what a young cattleman should be." One of Tom's proudest possessions was the saddle Roosevelt used on that hunt. He kept it for the rest of his life. Roosevelt and the Burnetts remained friends for years. The president later influenced the renaming of a small Texas town from Nestorville to Burke Burnett. Years later, oil would be discovered there. The town named for a cattleman would become a boom town built on petroleum. But that was still in the future. In 1900, Burnett had 2 years to find a new home for his operation. The leases were ending. The reservation would be open to homesteaders. The era of grazing on Indian land was over. When presidents come to hunt, what are they really endorsing? He found his answer in King County. Chapter 3. The Land That Fought Back. Out here, the land doesn't care what you call yourself. King County sits in the rolling plains of West Texas. The terrain is harsh. The population is sparse. In 1900, it was even more isolated than it is today. The nearest railroad was days away. The nearest city was a concept rather than a destination. The Louisville Land and Cattle Company of Kentucky had acquired a ranch there, the old 8 Ranch, 142,000 acres. They had tried to make it work from a distance, managing Texas land from offices in Kentucky. It had not gone well. They wanted to sell. Burnett bought it. The land was cheap, 25 cents an acre in some areas, 50 cents for better ground, $1 for the best parcels. For a man who had leased 300,000 acres at 6.5 cents per acre, the math was simple. Ownership was better than rental. Permanent was better than temporary. He moved his headquarters to King County, to a small settlement called Guthrie that barely qualified as a town. The 4 Sixes Ranch had found its permanent home. But Burnett was not finished buying. 2 years later, in 1902, he acquired more land, 107,520 acres in Carson and Hutchinson counties, purchased from the British-owned White Deer lands at $2.65 per acre. This was the Dixon Creek Division, named for the creek that ran through it. The water was reliable. The grass was good. The distance from Guthrie was significant, more than 100 miles, but Burnett was thinking in terms of an integrated operation, not a single ranch. Over the following years, he acquired more. Adjacent parcels, connecting strips, strategic purchases that filled gaps in his holdings. By 1910, the 4 Sixes and Dixon Creek divisions together covered nearly 1/3 of 1,000,000 acres. Let those numbers settle for a moment. 1/3 of 1,000,000 acres. That is larger than the city of Los Angeles, larger than many European principalities, larger than some American counties. The ranch was not just big, it was a geography unto itself. Operating at that scale required an army, cowboys, cooks, fence riders, line camp managers, blacksmiths, farriers, carpenters, teamsters, a workforce that rivaled small factories in the cities back east. The ranch employed dozens of men year-round and more during roundup seasons. The cattle numbered in the tens of thousands. Burnett began improving the herd systematically. He culled aggressively, removing animals that did not meet his standards. He imported purebred Hereford and Durham bulls, breeding them with the tougher range cattle to produce offspring that combined hardiness with quality. The results became consistent winners at livestock shows nationwide. The 4 Sixes was no longer just big, it was becoming elite. And then Burnett built his monument. 1917. Burke Burnett was 68 years old. He had outlived 2 wives. He had buried 2 of his 3 children. His daughter Annie had died young in 1914. His son, Burke Jr., just 21 years old, had died less than 2 years later. Only Tom survived, and the relationship between father and son was strained by years of disagreement. Burnett decided to build a house, not a ranch house, not a headquarters building, not a functional structure designed for the business of cattle. A mansion, a statement in stone that would stand on a hill overlooking Guthrie, and declare to anyone who saw it that this land belonged to someone who mattered. The cost was $100,000. In 1917, that figure is almost impossible to comprehend. The average American home cost around $3,000. A skilled laborer might earn $1,500 in an entire year. A cowboy might earn $500. Burnett spent the equivalent of 65 years of skilled labor wages on a single building. The stone was quarried locally and hauled to Guthrie by wagon teams. Teams of masons cut and fitted each block. The house had 11 bedrooms, multiple bathrooms, multiple fireplaces. The views stretched across pastures to horizons that seemed to belong to a different century. Around the main house, workers erected supporting structures: barns for horses, corrals for cattle, a bunkhouse for single employees, a dining hall where cowboys ate communal meals. The complex covered 18 acres, a private compound within the larger ranch. The complex was expansive across the acres. The big house was not just a home, it was a command center. The foreman and his family lived there, making decisions that affected thousands of cattle and dozens of employees. Visitors came from across the country. Will Rogers visited. Theodore Roosevelt visited. Business leaders and politicians and celebrities who wanted to see the authentic West came to Guthrie and ate at Burnett's table. The visitors marveled at the grandeur. There is an irony in the big house that Burnett may not have intended. The man who preferred sleeping in the back room of the 4-6's supply house among the merchandise and ledgers of his business built a mansion he rarely used himself. He maintained his office in the store. He kept his simple bedroom there. The grand house was for visitors, for legacy, for proof that he had arrived. 1 year later, nature reminded the empire that it was still mortal. 1918. The blizzard came without warning. On the Dixon Creek Division, 200 miles from headquarters, the temperature dropped. Snow began falling. Wind began howling. Within hours, visibility dropped to nothing. Cowboys could not see the cattle. Cowboys could not see each other. The world disappeared into white. 2,000 head of 4-6's cattle died in that storm, frozen where they stood, drifted into draws and ravines, piled against fence lines where they had huddled for warmth that never came. The loss was staggering. At prevailing prices, 2,000 cattle represented tens of thousands of dollars. But the financial loss was not the worst part. The worst part was the randomness, the indifference of weather to wealth. A man could build an empire, could buy 300,000 acres, could develop herds that won national prizes, and a single storm could kill 1/10 of his animals in a single night. The blizzard of 1918 was not unique. 30 years earlier, the big die-up of 1886 and 1887 had killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across the Great Plains. That disaster ended the open-range era. Ranchers who had let their cattle roam freely found corpses piled along drift. Fences, 250 carcasses per mile for 35 miles on some operations. Entire fortunes vanished in a season. Burnett had survived the big die-up by moving his cattle to Indian territory. But there was no Indian territory to flee to now. The reservations were gone. The land was fenced. The only protection against weather was preparation, and preparation had limits. If the land keeps fighting back, what does the ranch do next? The Dixon Creek operation recovered. The remaining cattle bred. Calves were born. The herd rebuilt itself. But the blizzard was a reminder that nature does not negotiate. Nature does not care about contracts or legacies. Nature kills what it kills and moves on. Burnett was 70 years old when the storm hit. He had 3 years left to live. Chapter 4. Black Gold and the Inheritance. When money comes out of the ground, it changes what a name can do. 1921. 3 years after the blizzard, drillers punched through rock and sand near Dixon Creek. What came up changed everything. Oil. The black liquid that would define 20th century Texas was pooled beneath Burnett land. The cattle empire suddenly sat atop something more valuable than any herd. Wells went up. Pumps began working. Royalty checks began arriving. Burnett did not live long enough to see the full scope of what had been discovered. He died on June 27, 1922, at 73 years old. His estate was valued at approximately $6 million, an enormous sum in an era when the average annual wage was less than $2,000. But the oil kept flowing. Decade after decade, wells on 4/6's land produced. The ranch became more than a cattle operation. It became an oil producer. The two industries existed in parallel, cattle grazing above reserves that generated royalties without requiring cows to eat or breed or survive blizzards. The financial structure this created was unusual. Most ranches depended entirely on livestock. They rose and fell with cattle prices, with rainfall, with the unpredictable economics of beef. The 4/6's had a second income stream. When cattle prices crashed, oil royalties continued. When drought killed grass, the pumps kept working. The ranch had been inoculated against the disasters that destroyed competitors. This dual income would prove essential in the decades to come. It would allow the ranch to modernize without desperation. It would fund investments in horses and genetics that pure cattle operations could never afford. It would buy time. Burke Burnett built his empire on grass and water. His descendants would maintain it on oil and adaptation. Burke Burnett's will contained a surprise. His son Tom was alive. Tom had worked the ranch for decades. Tom had hunted with Roosevelt. Tom had learned Comanche from Quanah Parker. Tom was the natural heir. But the will did not leave the ranch to Tom. Instead, Burnett created a trust. The estate would be managed by trustees, with income distributed to family members until a specific condition was met. The 4/6's ranch would pass to Burnett's great-grandchild when that child turned 25 years old. When Burnett wrote the will, his only great-grandchild had not yet been born. His granddaughter, Anne Valiant, was a young woman. The heir to the empire did not exist. The structure was unusual but not unprecedented. Burnett had watched wealthy families destroy themselves through inheritance fights. He had seen sons squander fortunes their fathers had built. He had seen estates fragmented among competing heirs until nothing substantial remained. The trust was designed to prevent all of that. Tom Burnett received income from the estate. He continued working the ranch, but he never owned it. He died in 1938, 16 years after his father, still managing land. That belonged to a trust waiting for an heir who was still a child. Anne Valiant Burnett Tandy, Tom's daughter, became the central figure in the ranch's mid-century history. She inherited her grandmother's share of the trust income. She married multiple times, taking the names of her husbands, Hall, Windfor, Tandy. She ran the operation with an iron will, maintaining traditions while adapting to changing economics. In 1936, there were 20,000 Hereford cattle on the ranch. The horse program was expanding. The oil kept flowing. The 4-6s had survived depression and drought and death, and the strange provisions of a will that skipped a generation. And with oil in the ground, the ranch becomes more than a workplace. It becomes an institution. The gates still swing. The cattle still need water. But now there is another layer, accountants watching numbers that never touch a saddle. When wealth arrives this way, it can harden a family. It makes every disagreement feel like a threat to the whole structure, because the land is no longer just land, it's leverage. When oil arrives, who becomes untouchable? Big Ann, as she became known, waited for the great-grandchild who would eventually inherit everything. Oil didn't just bring cash, it brought time. It brought insulation. It turned a ranch that could be killed by weather into a ranch that could outlast weather. But it also changed the moral math. When the money arrives without a herd moving, the work becomes paperwork. Leases, royalties, signatures, quiet agreements that don't leave hoofprints, and inheritance is not a ceremony. It is a process. It happens in letters, in court filings, in the way a family learns what can be forgiven and what can't. A ranch can survive a blizzard. A family might not. So, what do you protect first? The land or the people inside the name? Chapter 5. From Bermuda to Marlboro. A legend is just a product with better lighting. Who gets paid for it? Anne Valiant Burnett. Tandy understood horses. She understood them better than most people understood anything. The quarter horse had emerged as a distinct breed in the American Southwest, a compact, muscular animal bred for short-distance speed and cattle work. The American Quarter Horse Association was founded in 1940, and Big Ann was there at the beginning. She served on boards. She shaped policy. She understood that breed registries and bloodlines and proper documentation were the foundation of a premium horse market. She acquired horses that would define the 4-6's breeding program: Gray Badger II, Hollywood Gold, animals whose bloodlines still flow through the ranch's stock today. She invested in quality when other ranchers were cutting costs. She built a program designed to produce the best quarter horses in the country. Big Ann died in 1980. She had spent 6 decades managing an operation she never technically owned, waiting for the terms of her grandfather's trust to mature. The great-grandchild who would inherit everything had been born in 1938. Her name was Anne Windfor Marion, Little Ann. When Little Ann turned 25 in 1963, the trust dissolved. The 4-6's passed from collective management to individual ownership. For the first time since Burke Burnett's death, one person controlled the entire operation. Anne Marion would own the ranch for 57 years. She would transform it, preserve it, and ultimately determine its fate. In 1982, Dr. Glenn Blodgett arrived at the 4-6's as the ranch's veterinarian. He would stay for 40 years. Blodgett transformed the horse program from a breeding operation into something closer to a genetics laboratory. Embryo transfer, artificial insemination, techniques that had been developed for cattle but rarely applied to horses at scale. The 4-6's became a pioneer. The numbers tell the story. 24 stallions, 1,800 mares bred annually, an on-site equine reproduction center. The ranch does not simply breed horses, it manufactures them with scientific precision, selecting for traits that produce animals worth tens of thousands of dollars each. The Four Sixes won its first National Cutting Horse Association Best Bermuda Award in 1993. It won again in subsequent years. The Bermuda, the string of working horses maintained by a ranch, became a point of pride as important as the cattle herd. Cowboys who worked the Four Sixes rode horses that were worth more than most people's houses. A top Four Sixes stallion might command stud fees of $15,000 or more. A proven mare could sell for six figures. The horses that once existed to work cattle had become commodities more valuable than the cattle themselves. This transformation required capital, laboratory equipment, veterinary staff, temperature-controlled facilities, the kind of investment that pure cattle operations could never justify. The Four Sixes could afford it because oil royalties provided a cushion, because Anne Marion had the vision to see where the horse market was heading, because the ranch had always adapted to survive. 1963. The same year Anne Marion inherited the ranch, an advertising agency made a discovery in Guthrie. Leo Burnett, the Chicago firm that handled Marlboro cigarettes, had been struggling with the campaign. The original Marlboro man was an actor. He looked the part. He wore the hat. But something was missing. The authenticity that audiences craved was absent from his performance. A film crew came to the Four Sixes to shoot background footage. They wanted landscapes. They wanted cattle. They wanted the iconography of the American West. What they found was Carl Bradley. Bradley was a working cowboy. He had been wagon boss of the Four Sixes, a respected hand who knew cattle and horses the way city people know subway routes. He was big, hence his nickname, Big Un. He was weathered. He was authentic in ways no actor could fake. The advertising people recognized it immediately. They offered Bradley a role in the campaign. He became one of the first real cowboys used in Marlboro commercials, replacing the actors who had struggled to convince anyone they belonged on a horse. From 1963 onward, the Four Sixes became a backdrop for selling cigarettes. The red barn, the rolling pastures, the cowboys who looked like cowboys because they were cowboys. Ranch employees posed for photographs that appeared in magazines and on billboards across the country. Bradley earned $120 every time Marlboro used him on television. $1,500 for print ads in Life or Look magazine. He saved the money. He bought a few horses and cattle. He dreamed of owning a small place of his own. Then the government banned cigarette advertising on television in 1971. The regular income disappeared. Bradley continued working cattle because that is what he knew, because that is what he was. And when the myth is for sale, who owns it? In 1973, Bradley drowned. He was breaking a young horse in a stock tank on a ranch near Old Glory, not far from the Four Sixes. The horse went under. Bradley went with it. No one knows exactly what happened. He was alone at the time. The Marlboro man died in the water, on a nervous colt, doing the work he had done his entire life. He was one of several real cowboys who posed for the campaign and died young. The myth outlived them all. But the connection between the Four Sixes and entertainment was not over. In 1975, Roy Rogers came to Guthrie to film his final movie. Macintosh and T.J. was a quiet film about an aging ranch hand. The Four Sixes provided the setting. Real cowboys worked alongside the actors. The ranch that had sold cigarettes was now selling nostalgia. The transition from advertising to entertainment had begun, decades before Taylor Sheridan would arrive. Chapter 6. The Invisible Workforce. If the story is about cowboys, why are the workers always off camera? We have spoken of Burke Burnett, of Tom, of Quanah Parker and Theodore Roosevelt and Anne Marion, names that appear in histories and photographs and legal documents. We have not spoken enough of the people who actually worked the land. The 4-6s has always employed an army. In the early days, dozens of cowboys, cooks who fed them, farriers who shod their horses, fence riders who maintained hundreds of miles of wire. In the modern era, the ranch employs 50 to 100 people depending on the season, with approximately 20 full-time cowboys. Many are second or third generation. Their fathers worked here. Their grandfathers worked here. The ranch describes them as family. But family is a complicated word when applied to employer-employee relationships. The early cowboys earned $25 to $40 a month plus room and board. They worked 7 days a week when work demanded it. They slept in bunkhouses or line camps scattered across the range. Line camps were small structures, sometimes just a single room, positioned so that cowboys could monitor distant pastures without riding hours from headquarters. The work was dangerous. Horses fell, cattle charged, storms came. Men were kicked and trampled and thrown. They broke bones and continued working because stopping meant losing their position. There was no workers' compensation. There was no disability insurance. There was only the job and the alternative of having no job. The ranch kept detailed records of its cattle. It kept detailed records of its horses. The names of the men who worked the land are harder to find. We know Bud Arnett was the first foreman. We know John Humphreys and Jim Gibson and Sid Williams and Charlie Hart and Joe Crystal worked the early years. We know George Humphrey managed the 4-6s for 40 years. We know George Jeffers became foreman of Dixon Creek in 1949. We do not know how many men, over 155 years, devoted their lives to work that made other people wealthy. We do not know their stories. We do not know their children's names. The ranch describes its culture as family. The ranch describes its traditions as heritage. But heritage, like legacy, is selective. It remembers what it chooses to remember. Picture the day before anyone comes to film the brand on a gate, before any tourist shirt, before any myth. A bunkhouse wakes in the dark. Boots hit the floor. Someone strikes a match. Coffee boils. Outside, the wind is already working on the grass. The work is not romantic. It is repetitive. Fix the fence. Check the tanks. Ride the pasture. Sort the calves. Pull the sick ones. Load the trailer. Do it again tomorrow. And if you get hurt, the ranch keeps going. A new man takes the horse. A new name goes on the payroll. The story stays the same. So when the ranch says family, ask the obvious question: who gets remembered? And who gets replaced? A place like this also has an economy no one romanticizes: payroll, housing, transportation, a chain of small decisions that decide whether a hand stays or leaves. Some workers live close enough to see the lights of Guthrie at night. Others live so far out that the nearest neighbor is a windmill and a tank. And when the day ends, the ranch doesn't stop being a workplace. It becomes a world with its own rules about who eats first, who gets heard, and who gets remembered. What happens when the invisible workforce stops being invisible? There is also the part of ranch work that never makes it into the brochures. The loneliness. A line camp in winter. A radio that crackles but rarely answers. Miles of fence with no one on the other side. You learn the sound of your own horse's breathing. You learn the sound of coyotes when the wind is wrong. And you learn what the job actually asks of a body. Sun that burns through shirts. Cold that gets inside your hands. Dust that coats your teeth. A knee that stops bending the way it used to. That is why the idea of loyalty can be complicated. Some people stay because they love the land. Some stay because leaving is expensive. Some stay because every skill they have is tied to a place that only hires so many men. The ranch can call that family. It can call it tradition. The people living it might call it something else. A bargain, a trade, a life. Chapter 7. 3 divisions, 1 apparatus. This isn't one ranch. It's a territory with rules. The modern 4-6s operates as 3 distinct divisions, each with its own geography and purpose. The main ranch division covers roughly 142,000 acres in King County, centered on Guthrie. This is where the big house stands. This is where the supply house operates. This is the heart of the operation, the piece most people picture when they think of the 4-6s. The Dixon Creek Division spans approximately 114,000 acres in Carson and Hutchinson counties, more than 100 miles north. This is where the blizzard of 1918 killed 2,000 cattle. This is where much of the oil production occurs. The land is stocker country, used to receive calves from the main ranch and fatten them for market. The Frisco Creek Division adds another 9,400 acres in Knox County. Smaller, specialized, another piece of the puzzle. Together, the divisions total roughly 266,000 acres. The precise number varies depending on which source you consult and when. Land is bought, land is sold, boundaries shift. But the scale remains consistent, an operation larger than many European duchies. The numbers don't just impress, they explain. 3 divisions, roughly 142,000 acres at the main ranch, about 114,000 at Dixon Creek, another 9,400 at Frisco Creek, together about 266,000 acres. 66 water tubs. 1 6,000-foot airstrip. The infrastructure required to operate at this scale is immense. Wells and pumps, tanks and tubs, windmills, roads, gates, corrals, an airstrip, a supply chain, a maintenance schedule that never ends. Managing this infrastructure requires constant investment. The ranch spends $50,000 to $60,000 annually just to control bear grass and prairie dogs on the Dixon Creek Division. Prescribed burns clear brush, grubbing equipment removes mesquite. The land must be actively maintained or it reverts to conditions that cannot support cattle. The cattle herd includes approximately 7,000 mother cows. The resulting calves are born on the main ranch, weaned, then shipped to Dixon Creek to grow. This division of labor spreads risk across geography. A drought that devastates King County might spare Carson County. A blizzard that kills cattle in the Panhandle might leave the southern pastures untouched. Integration, diversification, scale. These are the principles that have kept the 4-6s operating while other ranches failed. The apparatus runs because each part supports the others. This is what scale looks like in practice, not a postcard, a schedule, calving season, branding, weaning, shipping, breeding, every move timed to grass and weather and prices that change while you sleep. Cattle flow through the divisions like a current. Born in one place, grown in another, finished somewhere else. Names become ear tags, then weights, then invoices. It has to run clean. One broken well, one washed-out road, one bad storm at the wrong time, and the whole operation feels how fragile it really is. There's also a kind of silence that comes with size. Out in the far pastures, you can ride for an hour and never see another person. No houses, no traffic, just wind and grass and the occasional creak of a gate. That silence is part of the brand, but it's also a warning, because when something goes wrong out there, you don't get help quickly. You get resourceful or you get hurt. So what does a territory this large need to keep running? On paper, it is land and cattle and horses. In practice, it is people coordinating across distance. Someone notices a weak calf at the main ranch. Someone else lines up a trailer at Dixon Creek. A vet gets a call. A cook makes sure there is food when the crew gets back after dark. Most of the time, you do not see the coordination. That is the point. When it works, it looks effortless. And in the middle of all that distance, there's a kind of choreography. A foreman calling for a trailer, a hand checking a well, a cook counting plates before daylight. Everything is ordinary until it isn't, because the system doesn't fail with a speech. It fails with a small delay, multiplied across miles. So the real question becomes simple. How long can you keep a place this big running clean? When it fails, the failures are physical. A gate left open, a pasture overgrazed, a truck stuck in mud, a storm that turns a simple move into a night spent searching with flashlights. Scale does not eliminate risk. It just spreads it across more miles, and it forces you to trust the system you built. Chapter 8. The Supply House and the Town. Every empire needs a supply line and someone to keep score. Guthrie, Texas, has a population of fewer than 300 people. It is the county seat of King County, one of the least populated counties in the state. There is no traffic light. There is no chain restaurant. There is no hospital. What there is the 4 Sixes Supply House. Burke Burnett built the store in 1900. For more than a century, it has served as the only retail establishment within 30 miles. Groceries, hardware, clothing, tires, ranch supplies, everything a person might need to survive in isolation. The relationship between the ranch and the town is symbiotic and precarious. The ranch provides employment. The ranch provides the supply house. The ranch is the reason anyone lives in Guthrie at all. Without the 4 Sixes, the town would simply cease to exist. This kind of company-town dynamic was common in 19th century America. Mining companies built towns around mines. Railroad companies built towns along tracks. Ranch companies built towns around headquarters. The people who lived there depended entirely on the enterprise that had created their community. The supply house still operates. Visitors can stop in and buy 4 Sixes merchandise, clothing emblazoned with the brand that has defined this land for 155 years. The store is part retail operation, part museum, part pilgrimage site for people who have seen the ranch on television and want to touch something real. Walk into the supply house and you can read the ranch without ever seeing the pasture. Fence staples, mineral tubs, vaccine cooler, work gloves, a new coil of rope, coffee strong enough to cut through a dawn that refuses to warm up. In the early days, the store was also a ledger, a place where a cowboy could buy what he needed now and settle up later. Credit, debt, another kind of fence. It was also a gathering point. News traveled through the aisles. Who got hired? Who got fired? Who lost a horse? Who lost a season? A town this small hears everything. Today, the shelves hold something else, too. Hats and shirts and polished souvenirs. The brand turned into a product you can carry home. And that is its own quiet transformation. When survival becomes merchandise, when a working place becomes a symbol, when a town has one store and that store has one owner, you start to wonder, is it community or leverage? In a place this remote, the store is not just commerce, it is continuity. A blown tire, a broken water float, a roll of barbed wire you thought would last the month. Out here, you do not wait for shipping. You drive to the supply house and hope they have it. If they do, the day keeps moving. If they do not, you improvise, you borrow, you patch, you make do, and you remember who had what and who helped and who didn't. That memory becomes its own social currency. This is how small towns police themselves without ever saying the word police. The supply house is where the romance becomes inventory. Feed, fence staples, diesel, parts that break in the heat and have to be replaced before morning. In a town that small, the store is also a bulletin board. News travels with receipts, credit lines become social lines, and the ranch's presence is felt in quiet ways. The school's enrollment, the cafe's lunch rush, the way a weekend feels different when a crew is in from the pasture. And then, one day, the quiet breaks. What happens next? The brand on the hat feels like pride. The receipt in the bag feels like dependence. Both can be true at the same time. And when ownership changes at the top of a ranch, the question doesn't stay in the boardroom. It reaches the checkout counter. Because the real question isn't whether Guthrie loves the 4-6s. It's whether Guthrie can survive a 4-6s that no longer needs Guthrie. There is usually a counter where locals talk without meaning to. Weather, markets, someone's kid leaving for college, someone's dad getting too old to ride. You can feel the boundary between people who live the work and people who came to photograph it. Both are polite, both are curious, but they are not buying the same thing. Locals buy necessities, visitors buy symbols, the same brand, two different meanings, and every time a symbol becomes profitable, it starts to compete with the thing it is supposed to represent. Chapter 9. The Fire That Would Not End. Fire is honest. It takes what paper says you own. 2011. Texas recorded its driest year ever. Hotter than 1956. Drier than the Dust Bowl years. The drought that came was not a single disaster, but an ongoing catastrophe that lasted years. The numbers were apocalyptic. Total agricultural losses in Texas reached $7.62 billion. Livestock losses alone totaled $3.23 billion. The beef cattle herd in Texas shrank from 5,140,000 head in 2010 to 3,900,000 by 2014. 1 million cows vanished from the state. Ranchers faced impossible choices. Feed cattle with hay that cost 3 times normal prices. Sell cattle into a flooded market where everyone else was selling too. Watch animals starve on pastures where grass had simply stopped growing. In the Panhandle, where the 4-6s operates its Dixon Creek division, rainfall dropped to 10 to 13 inches annually. Normal years bring double that. The pastures did not just dry up, they stopped producing. Extension specialists said it would take 2 to 3 years of normal rainfall for the range to recover, even after the drought broke. Some ranchers gave up. Extension specialists heard it repeatedly. Older ranchers looked at the devastation and decided they did not want to spend the rest of their lives rebuilding herds. They sold out. They retired. They walked away from land their families had worked for generations. The 4-6s survived because it had always survived, because the oil royalties continued when cattle prices crashed, because the diversified operations spread risk across geography, because Anne Marion had the resources to wait out a disaster that destroyed competitors. But survival had a cost. Stocking rates were reduced, cattle were sold that might have been kept. Pastures that had supported herds for a century stood empty, waiting for rain that did not come. The drought eventually broke. The grass eventually grew back. The herd eventually rebuilt. But 2011 was a reminder that nature does not care about history or legacy or famous brands. A drought can kill cattle on land that has supported cattle for 150 years. The equation is simple. Without rain, nothing survives. Drought is not just a lack of rain, it is a slow tightening. Water sinks lower in the tanks. Windmills turn and lift less each day. The air tastes like dust. The sky looks bleached. Even the cattle sound different. Shorter breaths, more silence. Every decision becomes arithmetic. How long the feed will last, how far the next pasture is, what it costs to haul water, what it costs to keep faith. A wildfire doesn't care about history. It moves with wind and fuel, not stories. And afterward, the damage is counted in things you can't easily replace. Topsoil, baked hard, grass gone for a season, fence lines twisted, water systems clogged with ash. For weeks, the ranch becomes triage. Someone checks cattle for burns. Someone hauls water. Someone rides the perimeter, looking for a breach you can't see from the road. The myth is still there, but the work is louder than the myth. After the smoke clears, what is the ranch worth on paper? Some people sell their best animals first, just to keep the rest alive. Others sell everything and walk away. Not because they want to, because the land gives them no more choices. When the grass finally returns, it does not erase what happened. It just covers it, like ash under new green. And after the heat, after the smoke, after the hard math, comes the other fire. Paperwork, appraisals, lawyers, the beginning of a sale. Fire is not just flames, it is aftermath. Charred posts, wire on the ground like spilled thread, a pasture that looks like the surface of the moon, then the first green shoots, then the invasive brush that returns faster than the native grass. Rebuilding is slow work. Stretch the wire, set the posts, haul the feed, haul the water. Watch the sky like it owes you something, and the mental toll is real, because you do not just lose grass, you lose confidence. You start making decisions from fear. You sell earlier. You hold back longer. You change what you raise because the old way feels too risky. That is the quiet legacy of a year like 2011. It stays in the herd. It stays in the budget. It stays in the way people talk about weather, long after the rain finally comes. Chapter 10. The Sale. At some point, every dynasty meets a price tag. Anne Marion died on February 11th, 2020. She was 81 years old. She had owned the 4-6s for 57 years. Her will was clear. The ranch was to be sold, all of it, all 3 divisions, all 266,000 acres, the horses, the cattle, the brand, everything. The listing price was $341 million. For that sum, a buyer would acquire one of the most famous ranches in American history, plus roughly 6,500 head of cattle, plus the horse operation, plus the oil production, plus the merchandise rights, plus the legend. There was a condition. The ranch had to be sold as a single unit. No dividing the parcels among different buyers. No splitting the cattle from the land from the horses. All or none. 5 potential buyers emerged over the following months. Each conducted due diligence. Each considered the numbers. Each ultimately walked away. The price was too high. The conditions were too restrictive. The economics did not work. The estate was trapped. They could not sell in pieces. They could not find a buyer willing to take the whole thing. The ranch that had survived droughts and blizzards and depressions seemed finally to have met an obstacle it could not overcome. Selling a ranch like this is not like selling land. It is like selling a living contract. There are mineral interests and water rights, grazing plans and breeding programs, paychecks and pensions, equipment yards, housing, roads, fences that never stop falling down. A buyer has to want the legend, but they also have to accept the obligations that come with it, the costs that do not show up in a glossy listing. That is why so many serious bidders hesitate. They can afford the price. What they fear is the responsibility and the attention, because by then America had started watching ranches again, on screens, in merch stores, in a new kind of mythology that turns private land into public entertainment. The 4-6s was no longer just property. It was content. It was a symbol, and symbols attract people who do not just buy land. They buy a story. For the people who worked there, the sale was not an abstract headline. It was a fog that rolled into every day. Would the new owners keep the same foreman? Would they keep the same crews? Would they keep the same wages? Would the houses still be houses? Or would they become set pieces? Even the cattle feel uncertainty, not emotionally, logistically. When managers hesitate, the timing slips. When timing slips, the grass gets wasted, or the calves get light, or the market turns against you. A ranch this large can absorb mistakes, but it cannot ignore them forever, not when the margins are thinner than the myth suggests. And there is one more problem with selling a legend. Legends do not come with instruction manuals. They come with expectations. The sale also forces an ugly translation. How do you price a century of decisions? How do you price a reputation built by people who never got their names on the deed? Buyers talk about assets. Locals talk about belonging. Workers talk about stability. Everyone is describing the same thing. They're just using different words. If you buy the legend, do you inherit the ghosts? A buyer is not just purchasing land. They are purchasing scrutiny from locals, from fans, from people who have never set foot in King County but believe they own a piece of the story. So the question becomes less about price and more about motive. Why would anyone want all of this? Now, the brokers know how to sell a ranch. Photographs, history, a promise of privacy. But 4-6s was never only about privacy. It was about visibility, about a brand that already lived in public imagination. Sales like this don't feel like a handshake. They feel like an autopsy. Lawyers turning fences into line items. Accountants assigning values to water and grass and goodwill. Everyone asking the same question in different language. What is the story worth, and who is responsible for it? And for the people who live around the ranch, a sale is never just ownership. It's access, jobs, quiet routines, the unspoken rules that decide who belongs and who doesn't. When the name on the gate changes, the air changes with it. That makes the buyer pool even smaller. You need someone who can afford the land, and someone who can live with the spotlight, and someone who actually wants the work to keep happening after the headlines fade. In other words, you need a buyer who is purchasing more than real estate, someone purchasing a role. And then Taylor Sheridan made a call. Chapter 11. The Collector and the Showman. Once the myth is famous, strangers start buying pieces of it. Before we continue to Sheridan, we must return to Anne Marion, not the rancher, the philanthropist. The Burnett Foundation, which Anne Marion established in 1978, has distributed more than $1 billion in grants since its founding. $1 billion. The number requires repetition because it is difficult to comprehend. Texas Christian University received $50 million for a medical school that now bears Anne Marion's name. The Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth received support for a $65 million expansion, including a new building designed by the renowned Japanese architect Tadao Ando. In 1997, Anne Marion and her husband John founded the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The founding gift was $10 million from the Burnett Foundation. It was one of the first major American museums dedicated to a single female artist. Anne Marion was an art collector of international stature. Her personal collection included works by Willem de Kooning, Archila Gorky, Ellsworth Kelly, and Mark Rothko. After her death, several of these masterworks were donated to the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. Anne Marion lived two lives simultaneously. In one, she was a rancher who maintained 19th-century traditions on West Texas land. In the other, she was a patron who shaped contemporary art museums across the American Southwest. The two lives did not contradict each other. They were expressions of the same impulse, to build something that would last. Taylor. Sheridan grew up on ranches in Texas. He understood cattle and horses before he understood screenwriting. He worked as an actor for years, appearing in small roles on television shows that most people have forgotten. He was good enough to survive. He was not famous. That is the strange trade of modern ranch mythology. The more it is displayed, the more it has to be simplified. A saddle in a glass case, a photograph on a wall, a slogan on a T-shirt. The real ranch is more complicated than any exhibit. It's paperwork and weather and labor. It's arguments over water, over access, over what preservation even means. And every time the story is packaged, something gets left out on purpose. What does it mean to preserve something by displaying it? Then he started writing Sicario, Hell or High Water, Wind River, films that explored violence and landscape and the costs of living in places that America had largely forgotten. Critics noticed. Awards followed. Sheridan was no longer just an actor who wrote on the side. In 2018, Yellowstone premiered on the Paramount Network. The show told the story of the Dutton family, owners of a vast Montana ranch, threatened by developers and politicians and rivals. Kevin Costner starred. The viewership was enormous. Millions of Americans who had never been on a ranch tuned in weekly to watch cowboys fight for land. Sheridan had convinced Anne Marion to let him film on the 4 Sixes in 2019. Jimmy Herdstrom, a character from Yellowstone, played by Jefferson White, was sent to the ranch to learn how to be a real cowboy. The footage was authentic. The location was unmistakable. Viewers responded. When Marion died, the estate called Sheridan. Would he be interested in buying? The reported conversation has become part of the ranch's modern mythology. Sheridan asked how much. They said $350 million. He said he was about $330 million short. They gave him 2 weeks to figure it out. In January 2022, the sale closed for a reported figure somewhere between $192 million and $320 million, depending on the source. He assembled investors. He negotiated with Paramount Network. He signed a new deal reportedly worth $200 million. He committed to creating more content. The money from entertainment would fund his dream of owning the ranch that had inspired him. The American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers explicitly noted that the actual sale price was undisclosed. What matters is that Taylor Sheridan and his investment group now owned the 4 Sixes Ranch. Joe Leathers, the general manager, had never seen an episode of Yellowstone when Sheridan came to tour the property. He told Sheridan he could see more downside than upside. Why would he risk the ranch's reputation just to be on television? He walked out of the meeting. 3 days of touring later, Leathers changed his mind. Sheridan understood ranching. He understood the work. He was not just buying a brand, he was buying a way of life. Joe Leathers works for Sheridan now. He still has not watched Yellowstone. Chapter 12. What Remains. When the cameras leave, the land still has to function. The cowboys still saddle up before dawn. They still gather cattle on horseback. They still work roundups the way Burke Burnett's men worked them more than 100 years ago. No four-wheelers, no helicopters. The tradition persists because the tradition works. Horses can navigate terrain that machines cannot reach. They can cross draws and climb slopes and move through brush that would stop a vehicle. Cowboys can read cattle in ways that technology cannot replicate. They see the animals that are starting to separate from the herd, the ones that are sick, the ones that are about to bolt. Experience matters more than equipment. The horse-drawn chuck wagon still appears at roundup time. Cowboys and visitors can eat a Western-style meal on the range, squatting, on their haunches around a fire eating beef and beans from tin plates. The experience is curated, but it is not entirely false. Real work happens. Real cattle move. Real horses carry real riders across real land. The return to the Bermuda sale in 2021 broke records. $3 million in sales, 168 horses sold. Ranchers from across the country sent representatives. The 4/6s brand still commands premium prices in the quarter-horse world. The cattle operation continues. The ranch is reportedly one of the top 5 Angus operations in the country. Sheridan has spoken about serving the pasture-to-plate market, connecting consumers directly with beef raised on a ranch they recognize. 4/6s, ranch-brand beef, is now a product line. The myth has become merchandise. The brush clearing continues. Prescribed burns and grubbing equipment fight mesquite and juniper across tens of thousands of acres. The native grasses return. Bobwhite quail and Rio Grande turkey and white-tailed deer thrive in numbers that would have seemed impossible when the brush was thick. In 2014, the ranch received the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association Outstanding Rangeland Stewardship Award. The television production continues. The ranch has become a filming location for the Yellowstone universe. A spin-off called 6666 has been announced. The ranch that inspired the fiction has become part of the fiction itself. The land heals. The land always heals if you give it rain and time. The grasses that supported bison before Burke Burnett was born are returning to pastures that had been choked with brush. The water that flows through Dixon Creek has flowed for longer than any human settlement has existed. And whatever you think about the sale, the brand still has power because it offers a promise that the old world can survive in the new one, that a place can stay itself while everything around it changes. But promises have terms. They always do. The question is whether the terms are written in contracts or written in the way people are treated when they step inside the fence line. So when you hear storied ranch, what story are you choosing? The empire continues because it has always continued, because it learned to adapt, because it never depended on just one thing. What remains is a rhythm that keeps going even when the meaning changes. A rider swings into the saddle, a gate opens, cattle move, dust rises, and somewhere nearby, a camera checks its battery. The ranch sells authenticity because authenticity is valuable, but selling it changes it. The work becomes a backdrop. The backdrop becomes the product. For the cowboys, the day still starts the same, but the world watching them is different. Sometimes it feels like respect. Sometimes it feels like being studied. What remains is rarely the thing tourists imagine. It's the work, the early mornings, the long drives, the repairs that do not make the brochure. It's the way a place keeps asking for maintenance, even when the cameras are gone. A fence post rots, a tank leaks, a gate sags, and the land waits for you to notice. And ownership, no matter how carefully it is framed, always rewrites a place. New priorities, new budgets, new rules about what can be touched and what must be preserved. The land does not care. The creek runs when it runs. The wind comes when it comes. The grass grows when it gets water. People care. People remember. People argue about what the 4-6s is supposed to be. A working ranch. A family legacy. A corporate asset. A public myth. And that is why the story does not end with survival. It ends with a choice. Who gets to decide what survives, and who it survives for? Chapter 13. The Mirror. The last chapter isn't about them, it's about us. We began with a question. Vision and grit, or something else entirely? The answer is both. It has always been both. Burke Burnett was a visionary. He saw opportunities that others missed. He understood the value of a brand that was hard to alter. He recognized that drought required adaptation rather than stubbornness. He was also a pragmatist who leased land from defeated tribes because that land had water and grass when his own did not. He lobbied presidents for favors. He built relationships with people his neighbors considered enemies. He did what survival required. Tom Burnett was both rebel and heir. He rejected West Point, but embraced life among the Comanche. He learned a language his father's enemies spoke and used it to build bridges that lasted generations. He was a cattleman who understood that business and friendship were not opposites. Anne Marion was a paradox, a rancher who built art museums, a traditionalist who funded scientific innovation in her horse program, a private person who became one of the most generous philanthropists in Texas history. She gave away $1 billion while maintaining a ranch that most people could not imagine owning. Taylor Sheridan is a storyteller. He creates myths about the American West and sells them to audiences who want to believe in cowboys and open range and a way of life that exists more in imagination than in reality. He is also an investor who saw an opportunity to merge entertainment with authenticity. He understood that owning the 4-6s would strengthen the brand he was building in Hollywood. The ranch has survived because it was never just one thing. It was cattle when cattle paid. It was oil when oil paid. It was horses when horses paid. It was advertising when Marlboro came calling. It was a filming location when Roy Rogers wanted authenticity. It was a television backdrop when Yellowstone needed a real ranch. The 4-6s adapted to every century it crossed because the people who owned it understood that nostalgia does not keep the lights on. And yet, the Cowboys still ride. The brand still means something. The land still produces. 155 years after a 19-year-old bought 100 head of cattle with a mark he did not understand, the 4-6s ranch endures. The poker story is a lie, but maybe that is the point. We prefer the lie because the lie is simpler. A winning hand, a moment of luck, a legend born from chance. The truth is more complicated. The truth involves drought and debt and death, deals with Comanche chiefs, meetings with presidents, brothers across the Red River, blizzards that killed thousands of cattle, oil strikes that made fortunes, a cowboy who drowned selling cigarettes, museums built with ranch money, generations of workers whose names we do not know, wills that skipped sons in favor of unborn grandchildren, Technology that turned a ranch into a genetics laboratory. Television shows that turned a business into content. The Four Sixes is not a monument to the Old West. It is a monument to survival, to adaptation, to the willingness to become whatever the moment requires while maintaining just enough continuity to claim the legacy of what came before. The next time you see that brand, Four Sixes in a row, remember what it really represents. Not a poker hand, not a gamble, not luck or destiny or the romance of the frontier. A purchase, a transaction. A young man who saw a mark that was hard to alter and recognized its value before anyone else did. That is the real legacy of the Four Sixes. Not luck, not romance, not myth. Calculation, persistence, and the cold understanding that empires are not won, they are built. Stone by stone, acre by acre, generation by generation. And then, if you are fortunate, they survive. This is why the story doesn't end with a sale price or a museum exhibit. It ends with a question about what we reward. We love survival stories. We love the romance of hardship. But we rarely ask who paid for the romance and who was edited out to keep it clean. And if you're still watching, ask yourself, whose story did you just believe?